Now we got to study. Now we're ready to study. So what I'd like to do today is a piece on hardening Pharaoh's heart. And in this week's portion, it's mentioned for the first time, to my knowledge. It's in chapter 7, and here Shuli always jumps in, chapter 7, sentence 3. And it's God who is speaking. And he says, God is speaking now, Va'ani akshe et lev paro. Chapter 7, if you have a Bible near you, sentence 3. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart. V'hirbeti et ototai v'etmoftai be'eretz Mitzrayim. And I will multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. Notwithstanding that, v'lo yishma alechem paro. Paro will not heed you. V'natati et yadi b'Mitzrayim. And I will put my hand upon Egypt. V'hotzeti et sivotai et ami v'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. Bishvatim gidolim, and I will take my people out of Egypt with great judgments. And so the classical question, if in fact God hardens Pharaoh's heart, then of course he's not going to allow the Jews to leave. Why should Pharaoh be punished? Why should Pharaoh be punished for something he doesn't control? It's beyond his control. Maimonides actually argues that Pharaoh was so evil, his punishment was that his freedom of choice was taken away. But even looking at it from that perspective at this point, it doesn't make sense that he should be receiving punishment for telling Moshe, I'm not going to let the Jews go, when God said he's going to have no choice but to not let them go. And so what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about freedom of choice. And here, Shuli, if we have what I sent you by photo, I know the computer is working slowly, but if not, I'll read it slowly in English. I'm going to be reading now from the writings of a Rabbi Elijah Dessler. I'm showing everybody the book now, Shuli. He wrote in Hebrew, but it's also translated into English, and it's called Strive for Truth. It's in 4 volumes. And he was quite popular in the 50s. He was a Haredi rabbi, and there is stuff that he says that, with his permission, he's not here to respond to me, but there is stuff that he says that I find very, very problematic, including his position on why there was a Holocaust, because we were sinners and all of that. But there are other pieces that he has written that I think really are magnificent. And either he was trained or he had an insight into the human condition that was unusual. And I hope that this shiur, that this session, perhaps could present a perspective of Bechira Chavshit, of freedom of choice. I know when I first read it many years ago, I found it so very, very novel. And yet, every time I read it, I'm able to gain something new. And here's what he writes about Bechira Chavshit before we go to the text. He's going to compare it to the ancient and not so ancient armies, Civil War armies, where warfare was not what it is today, where you don't even need soldiers on the ground on some level. In fact, there are military buffs who say that in the future, the only soldiers that will be in the field will be AI soldiers. They won't be real people. And that somehow the battle will be fought from the air or cyber or however it's being fought. But let's go back, let's say, to pictures we have seen of the Civil War of the North and the South. And the armies literally would march towards each other, and they would come up to the line of tension. One army is on one side, and the other army is on the other side. And believe it or not, he is going to use that to explain what freedom of choice is all about. Let's take a look at what he says. He says this at the bottom of that first page, which I sent you, Shuli. I think it's the previous page. You know what? Leave this page. I'm just going to read 2 lines and then we'll shift to this, Shuli. When 2 armies are locked in battle, fighting takes place only at the battlefront. Territory behind the lines of, and now we're in the text, one army, if that could be made larger, and if you're able, Shuli, just to point so people can see it.
Unfortunately, it's not letting me make it larger, but I'm going to see if I can bypass that.
Okay, I'm going to read it very slowly. When 2 armies are locked in battle, fighting takes place only at the battlefront. Territory behind the lines of one army is under that army's control, and little or no resistance need be expected there. A similar situation prevails in respect of territory behind the lines of the other army. In other words, they're at the line. There is a certain line, or what he calls Nekudat. There is the point of the battle. If one side gains a victory at the front and pushes the enemy back, the position of the battlefront will have changed. In fact, therefore, fighting takes place only at one location, though potentially the line could be drawn anywhere in the territories of the 2 contending countries. In other words, point A about the battle is there's a line of tension. And behind this line of tension, that's the area which is under the control of the respective army, of the respective armies. In battle, however, that line of battle moves. It's constantly moving. So the point of the battle is in movement. And if we were to stop time at this new point of battle, that's where the tension is. And the piece of land that used to be the point of tension may then be comfortably in the domain of a particular army who won that particular place where the battle had originally been taking place. Let me say it more simply. The battle is at a certain line of tension. That line of tension, depending upon the battle, is constantly moving. Constantly moving. So let's imagine now in the area of freedom of choice. Let's imagine for a moment that there is a thermometer and we draw a line, a horizontal line across that narrow vertical thermometer. Now at the line, there is a line which we can call the point of choice. That's the line, that's the battle where we're making a choice. Should I do this or not? Or maybe a choice between good and evil. That's where the line is. Above the line, there's no consideration, or beneath the line, there is no consideration. Let me read it in the next paragraph the way he says it. After having described the battlefield as I just did, and be patient with me because this is a kind of study of the Bible. The Bible has, it's like the Daf said yesterday, it's like taking a hammer, an anvil, and breaking a rock. The rock can split into many different pieces. Ayin panim la Torah. There are 70 different ways, multifarious ways to understanding a text in the Torah. And this is a philosophical approach to the Torah and understanding freedom of choice. And I'm very looking forward to hear what you feel about it. He says, the situation, now he's moving from the example of the battlefield to choice. The situation is very similar with regard to choice, in Hebrew, Bechira. Everyone has free choice at the point where truth meets falsehood. In other words, Bechira takes place at that point where the truth as the person sees it confronts the illusion produced in him by the power of falsehood. Everyone has their particular choice, and this too is a very important element to remember. No two people have the same point of choice. What one person may be struggling with, another person is not struggling with, either for the good or for the bad, and vice versa. There are no two people who have the same fingerprints. No two people have the same soul prints. No two people have the exact same point of choice. I'm going to read it again. The situation is very similar with regard to choice. Everyone has free choice at the point where truth meets falsehood. In other words, choice takes place at the point where the truth as the person sees it confronts the illusion produced in him by the power of falsehood. But the majority of a person's actions are undertaken without any clash between truth and falsehood taking place. Now, there's going to be no clash because in the simile, in the example of the battlefield, what's behind each and every army, that's not the point. That's not the point of tension. And so the majority of a person's, for example, do I make a choice that, let us say, if there's no water in the house, is it a choice that I'm asking myself, should I step up and make sure that I do have water in the house so that I can sustain myself? For most people, that's not a choice. It's not like everything that I do is choice, although it's very variable. I remember once saying, if you remember David Susskind, he was interviewing the person I think was masked, and a hitman. This person had murdered over 30 people. And Susskind wanted to understand how does he do this? How do you take the life of another human being? And he said to him, well, what did you feel the first time that you killed? And he said, well, the first time I said to myself, how can I take life? But I pushed myself. After all, I was being paid very well. And then he went on. And by the second time, it was a little bit easier. And by the 10th time, I wasn't even thinking about it. What does it mean, taking life? In other words, he was at a certain point of choice when he started his tragic, murderous ways. He was struggling, although behind that point of tension was a person who said, this is something I really can't do. But once having done it, something happened to his personality. Now, this too is a very important added element. Every action that we do generally has two component parts. The first component part is the action. The second component part is the consequence of the action on the doer. Example, I own a butcher shop. And I would never, ever consider taking the wallet of a customer and putting it in my pocket, taking $10 put down on the counter and put it into my pocket and walk away with it. That I would never, ever consider doing. That's not in my realm of choice. That's not in my realm of what he calls Nekudat, the point of choice. I just don't do that. But when I put the meat on the scale, it is in my realm of choice, maybe to put my finger on one side of the scale. So I'm not stealing outrightly, but indirectly, I am stealing because I'm disturbing the balance of the weights. And that's the way I'm ready to steal. Now, the argument is, if that's the way that I steal, two things has happened. The first thing that has happened is that I've stolen. I've taken money that doesn't belong to me. The second thing that has happened is that by putting my fingers on the weight, something has happened to me. It's changed my character. And it could change it if I repeat this over and over to the point that I'm going to arrive at a nekudah. I'm going to arrive at a place where maybe I would consider taking a wallet, or taking the money that someone outrightly puts on the counter. That's what we mean by everyone has a point of choice. B, no two people's point of choice is identical. 3, the point of choice is constantly moving. Every action that I take not only involves the action, what we call in philosophy the pu'ula, the actual action, but also the tachlit, also the consequence of the action. Or let me put it in the realm of sin. There's not only the chet, there's not only the sin, but the timtum halev, but the locking up of the heart. The heart, the soul is changed, and my personality has changed. So what I would never have considered doing before this act, I now could consider doing. And it goes in the reverse as well. Maybe I would never, ever consider opening my home up to a stranger. But if somehow I push myself and open my home to the stranger, it becomes easier. So let me take it in his words, Rabbi Dessler's words. The situation is very similar with regard to choice. Everyone has free choice at the point where truth meets falsehood. In other words, choice takes place at the point where the truth as the person sees it confronts the illusion produced in him by the power of falsehood. But the majority of a person's actions are undertaken without any clash between truth and falsehood taking place. Many of a person's actions may happen to coincide with what is objectively right because he has been brought up that way, and it does not occur to him or her to do otherwise. And many bad and false decisions may be taken simply because the person does not realize that they are bad. In such cases, no valid choice, no valid Bechira has been made. Free will is exercised and a valid choice made only on the borderline between the forces of good and the forces of evil within that person. I'll read just a little bit more, and I know I'm reading a lot, which is not the best way, certainly on Zoom. For example, many otherwise observant Jews are prone to speak evil of others, thus transgressing the law that says one should not slander without even realizing that it is a grave sin. Yet these same people would not dream of transgressing the laws of Shabbat. This is his writing, their evil inclination does not even tempt them to do this, or miss prayers, or miss putting on tefillin, because they have been brought up to do these things without question. There is thus no choice involved in any of these cases. Choice comes into play only when one is tempted to go against the truth as one sees it, and the forces on either side are more or less equally balanced. The point at which this equilibrium is reached obviously varies for the individual and depends on many factors, such as heredity, environment, education. But there is no human being who does not have a point of choice somewhere along the scale. And then he says, it must be realized that this point of choice does not remain static in any given individual. This is very important. With each good choice successfully carried out, the person rises higher in spiritual level. That is, things that were previously in the line of battle are now in the area controlled by the good inclination, and actions done in that area can be undertaken without struggle and without choice. In this sense, we can understand the saying that one good deed leads to another. And so in the other direction, the Susskind example, giving in to the evil inclination pushes back the frontier of the good, and an act which previously caused one a struggle with one's conscience will now become done without choice at all. The good inclination is no longer functioning effectively in that area. And so we have learned one sin leads to another. And as soon as one has committed a sin twice, it is no longer a sin to him. Kol hachote, every time one goes down the wrong direction, it'll be done over and over until the point where one rationalizes and says that the obvious sin, the obvious wrongdoing, is not a wrongdoing. It's a fascinating concept because it's saying, it sort of turns over the whole concept of freedom of choice. It's suggesting that for most things that we do in life, we have no choice. We have no choice. It's always that certain point of choice, and it's constantly moving. I'll give you an example of how different people have a point of choice. A younger person is on a bus, and somebody who is a bit more advanced in age comes on. Well, for some people, the point of choice doesn't exist because I'm certainly not going to give up my seat. This is my seat. I paid for it. I'm here first. And for others, there is no choice because I'm so ingrained with a certain type of proper conduct that I don't think about it because I'm going to jump up. I'm going to jump up. And for others, they're in a quandary. Not sure, not sure. And so that's the idea that everyone has a point of choice. But if I'm at that point of choice and I did stand up, well, the next time it may become much, much easier for me to stand up, and I can move from the realm of not choosing because this is something I would never do to the point of this is something I don't even consider because I'll always do it. It's like, wait, here I'm talking to myself because I'm heavier now than I've probably ever been, and I really have to attend to that if I can. Now, when I see a good pudding on the table, I have no choice. I gotta eat it. Gotta eat it. Yeah, but if I could push it away a little bit and get to the point where I'm struggling and I'm moving my point of choice, you know what it is when you get to a diet and you're really on the diet and that pudding is in front of you and you've been on this diet for a long time. it gets to the point. It's not your point of choice. Look, no matter what, I guess what it's saying, it's not that, here's another way of saying, it's not that choice is I have a 50% chance of doing something and a 50% chance of not doing it. There's always going to be freedom of choice, even if it's 1 out of the 9 billion. Do I make a choice when I'm walking through the street whether I'm going to, God forbid, take the life of another individual? I mean, it's no one on the Zoom would ever consider it's not a choice. I guess one would have to say that you always can do it, but that's like 1 in a trillion chance. Even 1 in a trillion is a choice. That's the point. 1 in a trillion is a choice, but it's just not going to happen. It's not something you're really choosing about. And it goes the other way, that there are certain good deeds that we do that we don't think about because it's clear we're going to do. Now, there's always the possibility I won't. So freedom of choice is not necessarily 50-50. It could be 75-25. Now, after that long-winded piece, now let's take a look at the text. God says, Va'ani aksher et lev paro. And here, I want to go to Torat Ahava on page 25 in the book of Exodus. And in this piece, I first put forward our question that the Torah says that God will harden Pharaoh's heart. So says God. If so, why should Pharaoh be punished for refusing to allow the Jews to leave Egypt? He had no choice. And here I quote Rabbi Dessler. Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler argues, page 25 in Torat Ahava, that every act has 2 elements: the pu'ula, the act itself, and the totsa'at ha'pu'ula, the consequence of the act upon the actor. For example, if a person steals, not only has something been taken, but the thief has been affected. His or her conscience has been altered, making it easier to rob again. We are the sum total of our actions, and our actions inform our personalities. They impact who we are. So too with Pharaoh. Every time Pharaoh refused to allow the Jews to leave, every time he said no, his personality changed, and it became psychologically easier for him to refuse to free the Jewish people. You know the old joke, you say to a friend, say stop 3 times, and you say has to be very, very fast, like those interviews. Within 2 seconds, what's your favorite movie? What's your favorite book? Right away. So you say to a person, say stop 3 times. Stop, stop, stop. What do you do at a green light? What do you do at a green light? Stop. You don't go. Once you've said stop, stop, stop. So it's in your system. I think there have been surveys that if one does that if you have a chance to think, maybe you'll say go. Stop, stop, stop. What do you do at a green light? Stop. No, you don't stop at a green light. You go. So too with Pharaoh. Every time Pharaoh refused to allow the Jews to leave, his personality changed, and it became psychologically easier for him to refuse to free the Jewish people. Says Dr. J.H. Hertz, whose commentary for me is still the best. He wrote it in the 50s. Such is the law of conscience. Every time the voice of conscience is disobeyed, it becomes duller and feebler, and the heart grows hard. Now, I want to share with you, and then I'm going to stop within 2-3 minutes. God says in Va'era, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. And then if you trace through the Eser Makot, the 10 plagues, after the first 5 plagues, it says and Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Only beginning with the sixth plague does the Bible then say, oh, and God hardened his heart. Let's think about this for a moment. God says, Vani akshet lev paro, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. And yet when we walk through the text, the narrative that tells us what happened when the plagues occurred and Pharaoh's reaction, after the plague of blood, Dam, the first plague, it doesn't say that God hardened his heart. It says Pharaoh hardened his own heart. After frogs, whatever that means, Pharaoh hardened his heart. After the third, after the fourth, after the fifth. Only after the sixth does it say, and onward, that God hardened his heart. Note that after the five plagues, first five, the Torah records that Pharaoh hardened his own heart, and as it was realistically still within the realm of possibility that he might allow the Jews to leave. Only from the sixth plague on does the Torah state that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Having said no so many times, Pharaoh's very personality had changed. He no longer had equal choice, as the chances that he would choose to let the Jews go was seriously limited and for all practical purpose, non-existent. I close with this. When the Torah has God saying, when God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, it doesn't mean that God from the externality is going to harden Pharaoh's heart. It means that God says, I will allow the natural consequences. I'll allow the natural psychological consequences of behavior to influence Pharaoh's personality, making it virtually impossible for him to allow the Jews to leave. I want to stop here, and I'd love to get my dear friends